You're listening to After Images, a podcast for cinephiles that takes a deep dive into moving images. Each episode features a special guest who is invited to explore a film of their choice. After Images is hosted by film writers Frank Bouleg and Marisa C. Hayes. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Our new episode of After Images podcast focuses on Stanley Kubrick's 1980 adaptation of Stephen King's celebrated novel, The Shining. To discuss the film, we welcome filmmaker, author, and producer Brian Yuzna. The Shining is frequently cited as one of the best horror films of all time, starring Jack Nicholson, Danny Lloyd, and Shelley Duvall. The screen adaptation follows Jack Torrance, a writer who takes a winter caretaker position at the remote Overlook Hotel, where his predecessor murdered his wife, 2 young daughters, and took his own life a decade prior. Jack arrives at the hotel with his son Danny, who possesses a telepathic ability, The Shining, and his wife Wendy, who does her best to live with Jack's deteriorating mental health. Before leaving them for the winter, the Overlook's head chef, Dick Halloran, warns Danny to stay away from the mysterious Room 237. Characterized by Kubrick's visual brilliance and Jack Nicholson's iconic performance, the film deals with a complex series of themes, adopting a form of storytelling heavily influenced by traditional fairy tales and the haunted house trope, where ghosts are many. The Shining's influence on popular culture, horror cinema, and literature remains ongoing more than 40 years after its initial release.
Brian Yuzna is an American film producer, director, and writer. He is best known for his work in the science fiction and horror film genres. Yuzna began his career as a producer for several films by director Stuart Gordon, such as Reanimator, 1985, and From Beyond, 1986, before making his directorial debut with the satirical body horror film Society, 1989. He also served as a co-writer for the comedy Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, 1989. He has directed several adaptations of the work of H.P. Lovecraft and has assisted many first-time directors, including Stuart Gordon and Christophe Gans.
Brian Yuzna, welcome to After Images podcast. We're delighted to have you here today to talk about Stanley Kubrick's The Shining.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And as you know, we always start off with the question, why did you propose this film and what does it mean to you?
When I heard your other podcasts, I realized that I thought it was going to be somewhat long, and I thought I would not necessarily do a movie that was so, like real personally special to me, but one that had a lot to say, that had a lot in which you could talk a lot about it. Because there's a lot of movies that I certainly could have loved to talk about, but I feel like The Shining just has so much about it that you can spend time talking about The Shining. And it was an important movie to me, mainly because 2001 was a very important movie to me. So I was about 18 when 2001 came out, Space Odyssey, and I had never seen anything like it. And I loved sci-fi and horror my whole life, and fantasy, but I had never seen science fiction on this incredibly, I don't know what to call it, serious scale, on this kind of mind-blowing scale. And I think it's really a landmark picture, especially I think for my generation. Then that made Kubrick a very important person to me in the movies. And when after 2001, he did the Clockwork Orange and I think Barry Lyndon, and which for me were not near as big a deal. But then when he announced The Shining, and I hadn't read the book, but I knew about it.
Mm.
And then I thought, wow, Kubrick is going to do for horror what 2001 did for sci-fi. And so that's why when I went to see it, I went with great expectations. And it was certainly an impressive movie, but it ultimately disappointed me as a horror fan. Because I felt like as visually incredible as it was, I felt like Kubrick really didn't understand horror. He didn't have the taste. And when the time came at the end of the 2 hours to deliver the horror, I felt like he didn't deliver. It's weird to say because it's such an impressive movie. So that was, so I certainly felt disappointed as a horror fan when the show came out. But I was expecting so much because they had these trailers, the blood coming out of the elevators and the two little girls, and you're just thinking, oh my God, what's this going to be like? And of course, I've seen it many times since then, and it has lasted. It's been, and I still have trouble really saying it's a horror movie. Yes, it is, but I still see the same thing. And I did read the book after, and when you agreed to talk about The Shining, I thought, oh no, now I better do some research. And so I watched the movie, I read up, I read the book again, watched the movie again, even watched the TV version that Stephen King wanted to do. And of course, I've seen the Room 234, and The Shining has become this incredible, almost like a conspiracy theory kind of movie, where people look at it and see so many things that they want to see, which is kind of impressive. But anyway, that's why I thought, well, at least The Shining, there's a lot you can have a good discussion about it.
Absolutely.
In what way didn't the film deliver the horror that you expected? What were you expected horror-wise from The Shining?
I don't know. I would say that The Exorcist delivered. It was, and Kubrick was offered The Exorcist. He turned it down. But it took a realistic world and realistic characters, and used a weird idea of Catholic supernaturalism, but it finally gave you that flesh crawling nausea that I identify with horror. And for me, when I was growing up, I tried to figure out what horror was. And I thought, well, if the movie is scary and it makes you, has lots of suspense, I would say that's a thriller of one sort or another. And then, when you add liquids, some kind of bodily liquid, that gets to horror. You're starting to have horror. Then if you add metal, then you have sci-fi. But the idea of, for me, since the time I was a kid, when I first saw my first horror movie, very young, the feeling it gave me was almost of nausea. It was a physical and psychological feeling that would make, I couldn't even sleep. And the first horror movie I ever saw was creature with the atom brain. So you see how far back that goes. We're talking about like 1954 here.
It's a great one.
Yes.
Wow.
And it, it's not a good movie, but boy, it sure scared me, and I couldn't sleep and all that. And a number of movies did that to me. The Seven Voyages of Sinbad, and the Hammer ones, and certainly Psycho was an incredible experience. And they deliver. At one point, they give you that feeling of nausea and fear. And The Shining promised that, but didn't give it. And I think the point at which it really fails, I think Kubrick from Beyond should edit this shot right out of the movie, is when we see the desiccated corpses in the gold ballroom with all their web spider webs.
Yes.
I mean, come on. Please, come on. This isn't right. You can't put this kind of a cheesy shot in such a. I mean, what is this? It's like a Halloween house or something. But anyway, certainly there's parts of it that are greatly impressive, and I think that I think a lot of it, The Shining. I mean, it's such a crafted movie, and the photography is so incredible, and the steady. And I tend to focus a lot when I watch movies. When I think about them, I try to structure the story. I try to see if I can structure how it was, built. And I think with Kubrick, one of the things is that I think he's quite distant from his subject matter. And I have read biographies of him. As a matter of fact, when I got my first Betamax, the first movie I recorded was The Killing, and watched it over and over. And that's the movie. Doing that is the first time I went, oh, I see how movies are broken into scenes. Because before that, I only saw them in the movie theater. And I never had the chance to go back and forth and see how it's structured, play it as many times as you want. And I love that movie. It's very, very, it's very influential for me. With Kubrick, I think his early movies had much more humanity to them, And I mean, The Killing, they're real characters. Of course, the dialogue is written by Jim Thompson. So you have this great dialogue. It's really a distant movie. It's almost like a documentary. We're telling the story, we're almost watching. Kubrick is not really involved in his characters, I don't think. And I think, I'm not sure, I mean, Paths of Glory is a wonderful movie. Lolita, I think the first half is incredible. I could watch the first half of Lolita, I guess the first third or something, up until Shelley Winters dies. I think it's beautiful. Space Odyssey is very distant. And I even think that something like Clockwork Orange, the first half, once again, I think is brilliant. And the second half, I feel kind of let down by. But it's incredible, the almost balletic direction, and I mean, the control and the power of the images. But they're still very distant, I think. And I think he even got more like that with Full Metal Jacket and certainly Eyes Wide Shut. I've never seen a less erotic vision of a movie that is all about eroticism. I mean, it's so unerotic, And yet I think so. I don't know. I guess you'd say that Kubrick's a formalist.
Yes.
He's so much more concerned with his structure of the sets and the lighting and the photography and the movement, and then he has the characters. You feel like the characters are just props almost for him.
Yeah.
And then he makes these very odd choices in The Shining. And of course, but I felt this when I first saw it, that Jack Nicholson was too big at the beginning. He's too much at the beginning.
Yeah.
They were all a little too much. The photography was so beautiful that even the boy who's never misses, he's never goes off base. Still, there's a little bit of a distance there. Everything is a bit staged, and yet, of course, I mean, which is not to say it's not just a great movie. I mean, some of the scenes you watch again and again, but I do get the feeling that he's more concerned with the control of the images and the lighting and what each image says. The idea you make this basically a haunted house movie, in which everything is so lit. I mean, in a completely unnatural way. Usually a haunted house, there's lots of darkness. I think one of the best, I think the best kind of haunted house movie is The Haunting, Robert Wise directed. I think that's almost a perfect haunted house movie. Another very good one is The Innocents. And they're both dark. And in The Innocents, I think the DP was Freddie Francis. Could that be?
So.
It was a wide screen, and I read once where the DP was saying he tried to have darkness on the edges of the screen and something kind of moving. Because when you're watching it in a theater, which it came out when you could only watch it in a theater, if the screen is coming, if your vision is filled, you're looking here, you're going to be disturbed by, or you subconsciously, it's unnerving. And of course, and in The Innocents, of course, there's this ambiguity about whether it's supernatural or child abuse or whatever, sexual repression, and The Haunting, certainly the Shining. The Shining fits the model of a haunted house movie. Visually, it doesn't. It has these incredible sets, and these three people are in the house, in this huge place alone, and yet somehow they always have all the lights on. I mean, they go into the kitchen, it's not just the light here and there. The whole huge kitchen is perfectly lit. And there's very little darkness in that movie. I mean, the darkness is white snow or smoke, but it does follow the what I think is the classic haunted house movie or ghost movie, which is that the protagonist is the ghost. And I think that's ghost stories tend to just want to bring you close to the point where the protagonist or you reading it realize, oh my God, it could be supernatural. But of course, it's very difficult to have a story that you just get that close and then it's got to be over, because it's that feeling that it could be like that. Just like with a UFO movie or something, an alien movie, as long as it's kind of like, oh, could there be UFOs? Could there? Once you get to that point, the movie has to be over, because if you see the aliens, it becomes a sci-fi movie. If you see the ghost, it becomes a monster movie. So I think it's kind of tricky. And in The Shining, it certainly, I mean, certainly it fits all the tropes of a haunted house in that the house possesses Jack Nicholson as much as the Hill House possesses Eleanor. If you remember Haunting of Hill House, which is a much more true adaptation of the book by Shirley Jackson, the Eleanor, her mother dies and she takes the car because she got a letter to go to this house, and she feels like it's been calling her. And when Jack Nicholson goes, he says, "I feel like a deja vu. I feel like the first time I got here, I just felt like I knew what was behind every corner. I felt like he says, I just felt like I belonged here." And that's the typical haunted house. That's certainly fits the haunted house tropes. So I think that it fits all the haunted house. It's an odd way of telling the story, and it doesn't finally, I think Kubrick said that he's quoted as saying that it was a movie about a family going mad together. I mean, you can take that as you will. I mean, that's what directors always say. What is your movie about? Well, it's about, the Tenant by Polanski. He says, oh, it's about renting a house. It's about moving into it. You find if you're doing something supernatural, you can't say it's about the supernatural because you have to have a story. And I think that Kubrick focused on that. I don't think he had a feel for. He couldn't find places where you really felt scared. And I think in The Haunting, for example, there's many places where you feel quite scared. I think maybe the scariest scene in The Shining is when the wife, I forget her name now,
Wendy,
reads the book.
Yes.
I mean, that's an amazing accomplishment.
Yes.
That looking at paper, because you feel all of a sudden you've been built up this whole situation, and then all of a sudden you go, oh man, this guy is out of his mind.
It's the first time that she truly enters into his psyche somehow, isn't it? That she truly sees what's behind the mask.
Yeah, and it's all through the evidence, I guess. One of the things I noticed that I remember from a couple Kubrick biographies that I read like 10 or 15 years ago. But I remember that when he was a kid, he wasn't a good student. He didn't go to school when he should. He wasn't poor by any means. He loved photography as a kid. He also played chess. And when he was still a teenager, he was the school photographer for his school. When that was, we're talking about like 1941 or something, right? I mean, this is, a long time ago. And he took pictures for Look magazine, and I saw some pictures that a spread he did for Look magazine. Look magazine, I think it's like, isn't there a French magazine called Match or Paris Match?
Yes.
I think that's like Look mag. I think it was the same thing. There were these magazines that basically showed great photos, great themes. And as a teenager, he had stuff printed, and he did one of his classroom, and he took pictures of the students and the teacher, and in a series of 10 photographs, he told a story. You could really see it. And he worked for Look magazine, did picture stories of many subjects. And when you see that, you go, wow, he really learned how to find how to tell the story with the photograph. No word, no text. You see, and I think that, and I think he was born in the 20s. So the movies that really influenced him originally are the silent films. And there's that style with silent films where you have to tell it with the images. And I get the feeling that, this was such an influence on him, and he learned with photography with stills. And sometimes I think I can see The Shining very often as a series of stills with a little bit of movement. I mean, there's some movement, but even the moving shots are so controlled. Yes. It's the camera that's telling the story. So I think that there's a lot of reasons why Kubrick did it the way he did. And they say that he was not someone who had a lot of friends, not someone who had a lot of relationships. And I think that you can see it in the movies,
And what you're saying about the visual storytelling is interesting because we too recently started watching the television adaptation that was written by King, and it's so much more dialogue heavy. I think that for King, it was so hard to let go of some of the messages that he had sort of encrypted and embedded into the novel, that this was his chance to sort of rectify that. But in the end, it becomes a lot more text based, whereas Kubrick's film is just such gorgeous visual storytelling.
I think Kubrick couldn't do the King story. I mean, I think the King novel is definitely effective. When I first read it, it was one of those books where there's only been a couple of these that I've read. Another one is the Mothman Prophecies. Another one is The Serpent and the Rainbow. These are books that somehow when I read them, things in real life started kind of coinciding. So with the Mothman Prophecies, I remember while I was reading it, all of a sudden I started feeling like things around me were conspiring in the way the strange world of the book does on reality. And and in The Shining, I remember I was checking into a hotel in Oporto for a festival while I was reading the part about room 217. And we checked into, me and my daughter, we checked into room 217. Oh, this is perfect, But I thought that The Shining, when I first read it, I felt it was very, very, I really got into it. When I read it recently again, I was much less involved. And it could be because my mind was on the movie. And because I was reading it for this, right? Because I thought, well, I want to get my ideas straight. I remember in the book, I felt like one of the scenes in the book that kind of worked real well for me was the wasp nest. And in the movie, Kubrick took it out. And I kind of felt like when I read the book the first time, I felt like the wasp nest was really had kind of a meaning, supernatural sort of meaning. When I read the book again, I realized that it was really much more, it did have that, but because Stephen King knows how to go to horror.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the Pet Cemetery is real horror. That's real horror, and he hits it in the Pet Cemetery. In the Shining, I think the point of that wasp thing is to show him endangering his son.
Uh-huh.
And then in the script he wrote for the TV show, it is basically only that. I didn't get any. Of course, I felt like the TV series was just so uninvolving and so, so of its time. I can't even believe it was such a. I mean, it got a big audience, but it's just so. I don't know. I mean, it just didn't have. For me, it didn't work hardly at all. There was a moment when the Jack Torrance character, when he starts going crazy, where I felt like that was working for me as as madness in a very kind of realistic way, much more realistic than Jack Nicholson. But the thing about the book that I found the least, the thing that bothered me the most this recent time I wrote it, was that it was all built around they're going to blow up the hotel with the furnace.
Yes. Yeah.
And which was telegraphed from the beginning. And then it blows up at the end. I remember once years ago when I used to go to a lot of these horror festivals in Europe, and I forget some journalist or something I was having drinks with in one of these things. He said, we always know that in a Hollywood movie, in an American movie, generally the motivation is going to be money, and the solution is going to be a big explosion. And I thought, that's pretty true. I mean, it is, and I'm sure that's something that just is post World War II because it's based on the Hiroshima. It's based on the fact that, hey, the war ended because of a big bomb. Okay, so everything can be solved if we just have a big explosion. It makes people feel like it's cathartic. And I felt like in the book, this time reading it, I was kind of going, so they're going to depend on one person to keep these boilers going, to keep the huge building warm, and these boilers are in danger of blowing up all the time. I don't know. It seems like, what if the guy gets sick or he can't make it? I don't know. It just doesn't seem logical. When I was reading the book the first time, I never noticed that. And I think in the movie, the only thing that's left is we see the wife, Shelley Duvall character, one shot of her doing the work. I think I think in the book there's a lot of words dedicated to Jack Torrance researching the history of the hotel. In the movie, we see a scrapbook in one shot while he's typing with some pictures. So Kubrick just sort of started distilling this, I guess, I don't know, from a beer into grain alcohol. I mean, he started taking away everything until you just have, some essence that he felt comfortable with, that was simple enough. So I don't like the blowing up. I also way prefer the ending in the movie. I always felt from the first time I saw it, I was very disappointed by the killing of Scatman Crothers, because I felt like it was too quick.
Yes.
I think what Kubrick was doing was what Hitchcock did in Psycho, which was saying, I'm going to kill the main character.
mm,
And you won't know what's going to happen. And
mm,
there's a lot of movies try to do this. They say
mm.
when we do this, all bets are off.
Yeah.
And I think Kubrick's intention, my personal opinion, is that his intention was that this would be such a shock
Mm,
that you would now feel like you've been unmoored. You now you're just gone flying off the edge. But I don't think it really worked. I mean, it does work in the sense that it's shocking.
yes.
And I don't know if there's anything to be gained by drawing out the death of
Mm,
I forget the name of the character, Scatman Crothers' character. But I just feel like that's an example of. I think it. I don't think it worked the way it should have,
mm, mm.
or that I think that he wanted it to work as.
Um, I'm wondering if all the things you're mentioning concerning the failure that you see concerning the ability of Kubrick to really create a horror mood might not relate to one thing that you mentioned a little earlier, which is the fact that he was a chess player. Um, would you agree if I say that for him it's something of a thought experiment and that all the characters are somehow pieces on a chessboard that he's playing with?
I agree. And I really hate to say, I hate to like be saying, "Oh, Kubrick, look at all look at the failure of this." It's so
Mm,
ridiculous, right? I mean, it's ridiculous because I mean, I felt that way when I saw Eyes Wide Shut,
mm,
and I was really looking forward to it. And when it was over, I thought, "Wow, this didn't work."
mm, mm,
And yet, it was still one of my favorite movies of the year.
mm, mm,
I mean, I thought, wow, Kubrick can make a movie that really doesn't work, and yet it's still amazing. It's a great cinema.
we're
It's
still
real.
talking about it 40 years after its release.
I think that's something you have to say
Mm,
that it's not, I mean, it's real cinema, I think.
mm, mm,
It's not TV. It's
mm,
not, I mean, it really is what you can do with a camera.
mm, mm,
And you really need to see it big. I
mm,
think the bigger, you really want to have the edges of
mm.
the frame be, you want to, if you got a smaller screen, you should move close,
Yes.
you
Mm,
know.
mm,
And the last, I watched some of it the other day um, and listened to the commentary by the Steadicam operator who
mm, mm,
invented Steadicams. And I watched the 4K
mm,
on big 4K screen,
mm,
and the detail was just amazing.
mm,
And in the way he spoke about how the lighting was done and how the shots were done,
mm,
and you realize how much these things were. Of course, in the stories of how many takes Kubrick did, and all this madness of just doing it again and again and again. And I mean, it's almost pathological, I think.
mm, mm,
But it's, I think, from the point of view of a camera
mm,
and sets and having the control that he had. I mean, when I think of making movies, I was thinking, yeah, you try to get control, but a lot of what you're doing is trying to catch a moment,
mm, mm,
or follow something,
mm,
or see where it goes. I mean, some people, I'm trying to remember some directors that I've read about will say, yeah, a film is like an adventure.
mm,
If you're making a movie, it's kind of like an adventure, and you're seeing where it'll go.
mm,
I don't think Kubrick's like that.
mm,
I
mm,
don't think there's any of that, and I think this chess kind of logic to it,
mm,
uh, I think, is one of my favorite directors is Fritz Lang.
Mm.
I've read biographies of him, books about it. I've watched so many of his movies. And he's kind of like Kubrick in the
Mm.
sense that he just saw the he, of course, he was doing silent
Mm.
at first, and for me, they're his most interesting movies.
Mm.
It was all about the characters were almost like chess pieces. He just wanted to control them, and the sets were so important.
Mm.
And I think that Kubrick, in a way, maybe it's because of his era, and maybe we tend to interpret his movies of the '70s. We forget that he's a child of the silent film, and for me, one of the great things about the '20s and late teens in the silent films was that it was a time when cinema or film was seen. Some people saw it as an architectural medium. That it was, and the ones I like the best are the expressionist ones, because that's what I love. Because expressionism is like surrealism, it's like horror, it's like dreams. And that's the stuff, and that's why I like horror and fantasy, because I feel like it's surrealist, it's expressionist. It's not realist, it's not realism, or if there is such a thing, but it takes light and sets and it wants you to feel a certain way. It's not about being the window on the world. It's not about being the Lumiere brothers. It's about being Méliès. It's about saying, this is what I want you to think, or it's a feeling that you should get, and a painting was doing it at that time. And I love movies like in English, it's called The Last Laugh. In which they couldn't move the camera, so they built incredible sets and moved them around. And Hitchcock started then, and he started as an art director, as I understand, and I'd read a biography of his where he said that once he built the set, he knew the camera placement. He knew how to shoot the scene once he had the set. And I think the easiest way to understand that is that if the set is a hallway, you know where the angles are going to be. It's dictated. If it's stairs, you know what kind of shots you can have on stairs.
But coming back to what you were saying about the importance of the architecture, I mean, and the fact that it's almost architecture in motion that we have in the films you mentioned. This got me to wonder if, to a certain extent, one could say that the Overlook Hotel is not the main character of The Shining. Wouldn't you agree that the hotel itself, the Overlook Hotel, might be the most important character for Kubrick?
In a haunted house movie, the house is a character, and I guess some people could say that, it looks like Jack Torrance is the protagonist, but then he ends up being the antagonist. But yeah, the hotel is a character. I think just like in The Haunting of Hill House, the house is a character, and I think that I do think that we want to feel like want a key. We want a key to the logic of how Jack Torrance could be in the picture at the end. How all these things. But I think a logic to that is contradictory to the supernatural. If you want that logic, you shouldn't want that logic. And you shouldn't, I've read arguments where they say, it's like he's reincarnated or something. I go, why you're taking the supernatural out of it now? That now you're saying, there's a logic, there's a symbolism. I think that's something that maybe is more poetic than prose. And I think that's, we should be careful about that. I feel like the supernatural part of it is not in the structure of the movie, the plot structure. I think it's in Kubrick's vision of making this huge, impressive space odyssey type of set. And it doesn't, it is kind of creepy, but I'm not sure so. It's very impressive, you know. It's like the gold ballroom is so huge. I mean, it could be an alien, it could be ET or something, it could be the alien mothership or something, you know. But I think the beats of his being kind of possessed by the hotel is they work very well, you know. I think that the structure of it is, or I think he's not a nice guy. You don't get the feeling that he's, you know, that he's very warm. You don't get the feeling in the book he's a real writer. You feel like he's a real person. With Jack Nicholson, I'm not sure I ever really thought he was a writer. He said he was a writer. You know, I didn't really feel that. I think when he began, when we really felt like he was in the first half of the movie, I think it's the little boy is where we see the supernatural and the little boy's vision. Danny, when we see his vision, we feel that way. The blood coming out of the elevator is so powerful, and yet we can only deal with it as a kind of as symbolic or something. We can't ever think that. I believe that those little girls were murdered that way. When we see that image, we go, yeah, that probably happened. I don't believe that the hotel was ever inundated in a swimming pool of blood. But it's really a wonderful image. So I'm not sure how that, you know, it never quite pays off. But Jack's madness, I think, pays off very well because I think it's, the first part is about Halloran and the boy and the shining, and the idea of the little finger and the kid speaking is 100 times better than the book. A boy, a teenager that he sees. I mean, that's, so what? Now I have read that boy, Danny, I forget the name of the kid that played him, that when he did his audition, he came up with that. He just did that naturally. Well, it works just wonderfully. And so once it's all set up, I think it's when the wife, Shelley Duvall, comes in to tell Jack that it's going to be snowing. It's going to snow tonight. Then I think it's right after that, or maybe then I think we push in on him. He gets angry at her. I've got to work. You should not come in here, all this. So he's already responding. But then there's the great shot that moves in on his head, and he's like that. And you kind of go, now it's beginning. And then the snow begins. You know? And then the snow begins. And once the snow begins, the little boy has the ball roll up to him. Now we're into real supernatural. It's not just being possessed. Where did the ball come from? Then he goes into the room. And then we don't know. We don't see what happens. So there's ambiguity when Shelley Duvall comes and Jack, he wakes up and he says, I had a terrible dream.
Mhm.
And then Danny's there with the
mm,
thing, and she thinks he hurt him.
mm,
And I think the fact that we didn't see what happened to Danny is generally you would think that's a modern movie logic to give ambiguity about it could have been Jack.
mm,
Yes.
mm,
I don't think we ever believe that in this movie. I don't
mm,
think it works that way because the movie, it just doesn't seem to have that kind of rhythm to it. It's not really building. We see Jack as crazy, but we don't quite, it doesn't make sense that somehow I don't know. Or maybe it's because it's juxtaposed with him at the typewriter sleeping.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
And
mm,
I guess it really begins earlier when he's in the bedroom and the wife says, "Don't." He says, "I want to go to the room." He says, "Don't wake up your dad."
mm,
Yes.
mm,
And this comes right before that, right?
mm,
And
Mhm.
mm,
he goes in, and and Jack is sitting in the bed, but now we see him in the mirror.
yes,
Yes.
yes,
It's almost like, oh, that's a kind of a typical thing in haunted houses.
mm,
Yeah.
Is
mm,
you start seeing mirrors or people in mirrors, and
mm,
you realize that there's, you're in an intersection of
mm,
the
mm,
supernatural here.
mm,
And he has that creepy thing hugging Danny,
yes,
Mhm.
saying, "I'll take care of you." And Danny says, "You would never hurt us, would
mm,
you?"
mm,
Mhm.
But I think what takes away from feeling like he might have hurt him then is that then Danny goes into the room.
yes,
Well, when he goes into the room, he has no damage.
mm,
So,
mm,
I think structurally, that's from my point of view, that would be how it should work to make you, for at least a while, think that there is no supernatural. But I
mm,
don't think it works that way.
mm,
And
Yeah.
then it's after that, when she accuses him, that he goes, "I'm gonna go get a drink."
mm, mm,
Mhm.
mm,
And then I think the next big moment is when he's the great shot. I think there's three or four great shots of Jack Nicholson. And I think the next great one is when he's sitting at the bar saying, "I would give anything for a drink." And then he goes,
yes, yeah,
and at that, it's like he's going over.
mm,
Mhm.
mm,
Now he's got The Shining,
mm,
Yes.
mm,
and
Mhm.
now he's in The Shining. And I
mm,
mean, I think those scenes with the bartender, just great.
mm, mm,
Mhm. You mentioned earlier about how much has been written about The Shining, how many interpretations there are. It's certainly a rabbit hole that we can all fall down with various documentaries, etc. I'm just wondering, do you have any personal takes that you strongly adhere to in terms of thinking about Native American genocide? We have a lot of links in the film with that in terms of the fact that the hotel was said to have been built on Native American burial grounds. We see a lot of Native American artwork, but there's also been discussion of references to the Holocaust and all kinds of other theories. As you said, it kind of goes into the realm of conspiracy theory. But just for you personally, what really is there one that really resonates or that you feel connected to?
I think that I don't feel I don't feel connected to on a
Mhm.
personal level, but
Mhm.
mm,
from just looking at movies and trying to figure out how they're made, which I
Yeah.
started doing when I started making movies. Because when I
mm,
began making movies, I had no education at all. I was already 30 years old, and I just thought I would go make movies. I had never went to a class, never had any training. I learned by paying for it. I
mm,
borrowed money, I made a movie, I saw what everybody did. So I
mm,
had no I've at that point I started um, trying to figure out how movies were made, and I also very, very, very often when I see a movie, I'll read the book. I like if I can see a movie that's based on something, I'll do all the different media, because I think every medium has a different story telling way. For example, I would say the great Ambersons, the magnificent Ambersons, which is often, there's this whole mythology about how Orson Welles, if the studio hadn't fucked up the movie and cut it, it would have been brilliant. The movie is brilliant visually in a lot of ways. I love so much of it. But I've read books. I read what the editor, what's his name, Robert Wise said about it. I feel, my opinion is they probably got the best movie they could out of the footage. But I also, when people argue and they say, "Oh, well, it was, he had different intentions." I read the book. I saw the movie. I heard that. I went and read the book, The Magnificent Ambersons. You can see because I'm very interested in how, if you're going to make a movie, how you take the material and how do you develop it into another medium. And then I listened to the radio play that Orson Welles himself put on his own radio, because I also listened to a lot of the old radio shows and radio drama, and that none of them had a different ending. None of them resolved, and all of them, of course, do different things to tell the story. And so I feel like there's I do think that there's a way that you develop. I guess I got lost down a rabbit hole. What was the question? What was the question you asked?
Is there any of the many interpretations that have been
if there's anything that I identify particularly? Okay, so I will say that I'm a little bit like Kubrick in that way, and that I'm kind of distanced. Right? I don't have I don't see a coherent interpretation. And I'm also basing this on my own experience of making movies, of directing. And a few times when I produced, directed, wrote, a lot of the movies I've made, of course, just like anybody, it's kind of like a negotiation with other players. Maybe people with the money, the people. There's always a lot of give and being able to often. I mean, that's just how the movie turns out. It becomes those influences. So I would say that the Indian burial ground, is that important? Yeah, I think so. I think it's the basis of it, and maybe that's where the blood comes from. But an Indian burial ground is not the site of a massacre. It's that this is holy ground of a different culture that has different non-physical kind of power, and we all understand. And I think what Halloran says to Danny, and I think this is in the book, and one of the best explanations for supernatural ghosts and haunted places is that it's a remnant. It's like burnt toast.
Yeah.
If you burn toast, the toast is gone, but the smell remains. And I've had that experience here in this house. In the late 80s, the house I'm in now, we woke up in the middle of the night, it was burning. And we had to leave, and they came and they saved it. But it took 8 months to fix the house. And one of the things that I never understood, people would say, "Oh, there's smoke damage."
mm,
I'd say, "What's smoke damage?" But I could open a drawer. There would be a thin film of
uh-huh,
gray
mm,
over everything
mm,
in certain rooms. And I'd
mm,
open the drawer, and my socks would be there, and they'd be covered. They just have this gray.
mm,
When I picked up a sock, it was perfectly colored,
mm,
perfect. Didn't even penetrate. So,
mm,
so then they take everything out, clean it, they paint everything. For 20 years,
mm,
25 years later, we lived here, then we moved to Spain and Indonesia. We came back 10, 12 years later, and eventually moved back into the house about 10
mm,
years ago. Just my wife and myself now.
mm,
And certain rooms, especially my daughter's room, which is right across there,
mm,
I could always smell the smoke. I'm talking about probably 30 years later, 25,
mm,
and I painted the walls, and you could still smell the smoke. And
mm,
eventually I bought that there's these certain paints that are glue. I mean, it's a big, so I love that. And I love that idea that
mm, mm,
if someone, in China, they have an idea that when someone dies, they their remnant continues,
mm,
and it gets less and less.
mm,
And certainly in some Buddhist cultures, they believe that death doesn't. See, in the West, we're like digital. We think that you're
mm,
alive or you're dead.
mm, mm,
That's it.
mm,
Well, in some say that no, the body decays at different rates,
mm,
and so there is a remnant that
mm,
takes time. It's not such a black and white situation. And I
mm,
like that idea. And so I think that Stephen King uses that with the Indian burial grounds. And I
mm,
think that Stephen King he has a kind of a very deep feeling,
mm,
instinct for the supernatural and
mm,
for horror.
mm.
And I think that's that and the fact that he'll just write forever are his strengths. I mean, and one of his great ones, I think Pet Cemetery is a
Mm,
great one that has the Indian burial ground.
mm,
I
mm,
think it's if you have such a huge Holocaust, which is the genocide of the Native American, the indigenous people in this country,
mm,
which is not to say that they were any more less violent
mm,
or
mm,
you know, or any better than the Europeans. I don't buy
mm,
that. But I do know that the stronger is the one who does the worst damage.
mm,
And
mm,
the horrors of the colonizing of
mm,
North
mm,
America is,
mm,
is amazing. And
mm,
so I think the remnant of that, the smell that's left over, must be
mm,
really strong. But I think for the purposes of The Shining, yeah, I think if 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 Kubrick left that line in there, he wants you to hear it.
mm, mm.
I think that when he put the Indian or the indigenous types of tapestries
Yeah.
and patterns,
Mm,
normally you would identify that more with the Southwest,
yeah.
Yes.
Arizona, or
Mm, mm,
where
mm,
you really New Mexico, in Colorado,
mm,
yeah, but you don't. But the fact that he put that in there was very.
mm,
I think he meant it, of course.
mm,
You're meant to. And then, of course, people go, "Oh, when you see the Calumet um,
mm,
um, baking powder
mm, mm,
cans with Indian,
mm,
Kubrick places everything." I do,
mhm,
and I think yeah, he put those Indians there
mm,
because that's one of the things he's juggling.
mhm,
The
mhm,
they say, "Oh, Tony is the name of the little the boy in the throat.
Yes.
And then, of course, a lot of times we see Tony the Tiger on the cereal. Do I think that Kubrick put it there on purpose? Yeah, I think he put every single thing there on purpose. Do I think that it's a cohesive kind of solution that he has a cohesive web structure of symbolism under the movie? No, I don't think so. I think that he's operating like every director I've ever known operates, or every painter, or every writer, or every musician. At one point, you're just trying to draw from your subconscious, and then you're trying to integrate that with a plan of logic, and you're trying to keep open the door to hoping things rhyme. I think Kubrick just is so much more extreme than anybody else. And they say, well, then the chair's gone, and then it's there. That could be because, and the stickers on the boy's door, all these things. It could be that he is trying to, like Freddie Francis, have something uncomfortable in the scene. I don't find it very uncomfortable, because the style of the movie is so brightly lit, so careful, so rigid, so controlled, that I don't ever get a feeling of that something could happen. I don't get that feeling. Did he take it away because he wanted to have this mismatch? Or did he take it away because when he was doing take after take after take after take, every time he'd try this, and the Steadicam operator was saying, he said he would do this shot, then they'd spend 3 minutes looking at it on video, and then they'd spend 3 minutes arguing about it, and then they'd set up the next time. But that there would be literally 60, 100, 120 takes of these things. And so I would think that, and then he said that usually Kubrick took one of the later takes. And he said on the scenes where Jack Nicholson is getting upset at his wife and stuff, he says, Jack began those takes. Sometimes he'd be much friendlier, much softer. And Kubrick would have him go, and Jack would start doing this and that until he got to raising his eyebrows and all this. And that would be what Kubrick chose. So I think that I think all that stuff was done on purpose, but I don't really buy that it was to get you off uncomfortable. And when they say, oh, the logic of the hotel couldn't fit, I don't really think that, because I don't think that's what, and Kubrick they did have a whole layout. They say, oh, how did Jack get it? Because some people say, oh, there's no supernatural. But how did he get out of the locker? Oh, there's actually another door. I mean, why even go there? Why? Kubrick himself said the movie's about a family going crazy. Your dad went crazy. It's the house that did it, So I don't really have a favorite, but I do believe they're all important, just like the deja vu thing. It's important. It's important. I saw a movie recently, a Belarusian movie called The Savage Hunt of King Sack. You know this movie? It's 1980, same year as The Shining, I guess. And it's based on a Belarusian folktale of King Sack, Sakht or something. The Savage Hunt. The Savage Hunt thing. This is kind of in many all across Europe, fairy tales and
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
things. But it's interesting because it's, of course, it's very dark, but there's also this point that, early in it, somebody says it's like a deja vu.
Mm, mm,
You have the mirrors, and
mm,
you have this idea. It's sort of the intersection of myth
mhm,
and of myth and reality.
mm, mm,
In this case, and it's in Russian, not Belarusian, but it's really promoting Belarus as a victim of, at this point, the Soviet Union, and basically it's about how the whole people can be victimized by the stories,
mm, mm, mm,
myths, by the fairy, by the legends.
uh-huh.
And so I think in that movie also has this idea of trying to somehow make it's sort of like a Hound of the Baskervilles thing, except with with supernatural.
Mm, mm,
I think that Kubrick is kind of doing that. I
mm,
think every ghost story does that.
mm,
I just don't think Kubrick has the taste
mm,
for
mm,
the supernatural that
mm,
Stephen King does. And I
mm,
kind of feel like more than anything, that's what Stephen King responded against. I know he
mm.
didn't say that. He said it's because he made Jack he made him too crazy. He made him
Yes. Yeah.
un, unsympathetic, and
Mm,
he, Shelley Duvall was too crazy. And you see
mm,
how he cast his TV series. It was the
mm, mm,
typical, here's the beautiful blonde wife.
mm, mm, mm,
Here's it's television, you
mm,
know. And I think that, Shelley Duvall was, except for wondering where the heck she got all those great outfits. My God,
mm.
these guys were poor, right? They lived,
Yeah.
you think she'd be wearing a t-shirt and jeans, but that's Kubrick, right?
Mm, mm,
I guess he's a formalist.
mm.
Yeah.
So what do you guys think?
You first.
I have to say that I'm really interested in the Native American aspect of the story, and I really started looking at a lot of the artwork and looking at what some of the tribes were that would have lived locally in that area. And it was really interesting to see that we tend to think of Kachina figures, which we see on the wall murals in the hotel. We kind of associate those with Arizona, but some of the tribes in Colorado, like Navajo, also use some of the Kachina figures, and those are ghost dancers that are kind of in between state communicating between worlds. So I always find that really interesting to look at the artwork that's been so carefully placed in the film. I love that. I love the idea of the American Gothic in terms of the hotel becoming like a castle and the isolated people kind of living on the hill in the castle. And of course, the weather is so important. So in this case, the snow. And I really like that kind of transposition of maybe a European Gothic tale to this setting and how that relates to Native American folklore. And especially all of the urban legends in North America that kind of circulate about the Indian burial ground.
And as far as I'm concerned, I think I was the first few times I saw the film, I was very much like you, unimpressed by the horror of the movie. But with more watching, I started to appreciate the formalism of the film more and more, the coldness of the film. And this last time we watched it, inspiration for this podcast, what really struck me was how similar it is actually, in a sense, to 2001: A Space Odyssey. In both films, you've
I
got
felt that. I felt that too. This
yeah,
this last few times I watched it.
yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, in both films, you've got those isolated people who are for in 2001 in outer space, but here they are lost in the middle of nowhere. And in each situation, you've got a monster inside the spaceship on the one hand and the hotel on the other, that is little by little feeding on the people who are really, really alone, really, they cannot reach for help outside. They are really, really on their own. And that really struck me, this similarity between the two films.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's interesting that we were just reading too that in terms of sound design and sound structure, that it seems that Kubrick was also going back to 2001 for when he designed the sound for this film. So that was another connection. Mm.
Yeah, I think this was he used almost all um, um, orchestra, previous orchestral scores for this,
Mm,
for just a few cues.
mm, mm.
Mm. Mhm.
Shall we talk perhaps about your current projects? Yeah, are you working on something at the present time?
Um, I'm always working on something, but it's really hard right now. I'm working on hopefully a reanimator animated series.
Oh, wonderful.
Fantastic.
That would be.
And I, I have, I have a lot of projects. The problem is that the business that I was in doesn't exist anymore.
Mm,
Um, and I'm kind of too old to really get in on the new business.
mm,
I'm not big enough.
mm,
Um, but it's the, if I go to a meeting, if I try to do something, I remind everybody of their dad or maybe their grandfather, you know, and that's not who you want to be.
mm,
When I started making movies, I didn't want someone that reminded me of my dad around. I got people that were,
mm,
from my world. So
mm,
that makes it awkward. But we're also right now trying to set up another Reanimator project, which is there was a Reanimator musical that
mm,
Stuart Gordon did, and the producer of that and myself are trying to get this uh, set up a deal to make a stop motion puppet version of the music,
mm. That would be
which would
fantastic.
be fun, you know. And I always have I have projects that are, of course, not IPs, but
Mm,
really the only thing anybody wants to talk to me about is an IP.
mm,
Ah,
For me,
mm,
everything's about getting IPs, and
mm.
so that's what we do. I just finished writing a novelization of Society with
ah,
the writer
Amazing.
of Society. So
That-
fantastic.
I'm just doing. Oh, there's the Pope. Yeah, never, that'll never get made. I just wrote it because we wrote a script that we knew it wasn't going to get made. We did a couple issues of a comic book
Mm,
and didn't ever publish it. And then
mm,
I wrote a novel I thought, well, I'm just going to try this.
mm.
I'll
Very
write a
good.
novel um, of the Pope. And it was only because it actually came about because I was in Amsterdam years ago and Jan Dunse. I don't know if you know Jan Dunse. And
No.
he's like Mr. Horror in the Netherlands.
Uh-huh,
He
uh-huh.
actually was knighted by the Queen for doing horror festivals.
Mm,
And he used to have this one called the Weekend of Terror, and
uh-huh.
I had gone a few times. And after the screenings, if you were a guest, you'd go to the red light district just as a tourist. And he told me that he had taken Dario Argento there, and Dario was shocked
Mm,
and upset,
mm.
just beside himself. And he says, the Pope must do something about this. And when Jan told me that, I thought, yeah, this
Mm,
was the time when they were having a lot of, it was becoming a big scandal about how priests had been sexually abusing boys.
Yes.
And it's you read those things, it's kind of shocking. And then I thought, and I was talking to another guy who has a festival in Strasbourg, and he was asking about, oh, well, how do you come up with projects? And I said, well, you look at what's happening with all these priests, and it's so disturbing. Dario said Pope should do something about it. So how about a movie about the Pope taking care of this? The Pope kind of is a superhero. So that's how it evolved. And then, of course, you can't make it the real Pope, but and you want it to be kind of the myth and reality to mix and all that, And so I kind of got carried away, and I got all into the idea of creating a completely kind of fake history of Christianity and created. I guess it's what people that are writers do. I'm not a writer, but yeah, I can see how you start falling down that rabbit hole. You start creating this. So I created this whole Orden de Octavo, and this whole kind of fake history of Catholicism, in which there is this these heroes that kind of like the Knights Templars or something, but that they have this mystical way of taking care of all the real evil in the church. And I don't know. It, like most of the things I do, I kind of get carried away, and I end up not really being able to tie it all together.
I read the book, and I read it, and I think it works. I mean, I think you just said that you're not a writer. I disagree. It's very well put together, very well written, and I really like the way you're playing with all these elements and weaving this with this web. I think that that would make an amazing movie. But I mean, as a book, it's fantastic as well.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. But this is another example of how, when I had the idea, and then a friend of mine, John Penny, who wrote, he wrote Return of the Living Dead 3 for, and that was one of the few movies I've made that actually started and ended the way it was planned. It's kind of like it was all storyboarded. And a lot of that was because John is a real professional screenwriter. And he really focuses on, story structure, character art, all the kind of real, what makes a movie seem cohesive. And most of the movies a lot of the movies I've made, they're just a shot in the dark, something like Society, or especially the Silent Night, Deadly Night. These things, it's just madness. It's just getting together with people, and when I work with Screaming Mad George or Woody Keith, you're just out of your minds. They give you a certain amount of money that you go, well, if we can do this, let's do it. They'll just it's not really professional. But with John, with him, everything kind of is really a much more traditional kind of story. And so I went to him, and we wrote a script. And in writing the script, I started working out the idea, But then we kind of knew we were never getting anywhere with that. I said, let's do a comic book. And I've got the pages. We just never published them. But I got, who Richard Raphorst is? He's a wonderful artist. That he directed a movie called Frankenstein's Army. You ever saw that? But he did a graphic novel called The Worst Case Scenario, which is just brilliant. But anyway, I got him to do the art, which was unfortunate because the whole thing takes place up in Northern California on the coast. And he drew everything like Holland. all the characters are Dutch. And it's supposed to be California. But anyway, it's still really cool. And then in the comic book, I started feeling like we needed to go back in time, And then I wrote the novel, and in the novel, I just felt like I wanted to go back to Pope Julius and, all these, and kind of create sort of an alternate, I tried to find people who were real, and then you could just kind of split off. So there's enough real in the mythology, the background, to, if you looked it up, you could find a lot of that stuff. But of course, it's all fake. And actually, it wasn't until a while after I did it, when we started getting into this fake news and all this fake stuff, that I started regretting. I thought, wow, you should never write fake stuff. Because all you're doing is contributing to contributing to this. If you're going to write, But anyway, it was. I think that was the most fun part of it, was to sort of create this old thing. And then also the part that I really liked the best was I also copied Stephen King and Carrie. I read the book Carrie, and I loved how he told it from like court records. And, how you just take different things. And I did that. I invented books that I do quotes from, and then I invented. But I tried to also base it on like Baphomet and real supernatural, magical books. But there's this Father Obadiah or something is being interviewed in court, the kid, and why he dressed up like the Pope and stuff. And I liked where he said, no, he wasn't dressing up like the Pope. He was becoming, because the garments themselves have power, and that's part of Christianity. I mean, that's part of Catholicism. Really get into the church, into Catholic teaching, and I was brought up Catholic. It's not far-fetched. That's I produced a movie in Spain called Roma Santa, the wolf. I wanted to call it the werewolf trial, and it was based on an idea that I had been trying to develop about a werewolf who was brought to trial. And he says, "No, I'm not guilty. I have lycanthropy. I'm not guilty. I went crazy. It's the insanity defense." And it turns out this really happened in Spain. There was this guy named Roma Santa, who was a seasonal worker, and he began killing all these sisters in a family. And he would make them into soap, because they would take human beings and they would make soap to sell in that area. Well, he was caught, and he went to trial, and he said that he was a werewolf, so he wasn't guilty. And what was fascinating was that the aristocracy, the church, and the scientific community of that time supported him. And they brought in a mesmerist from France
Mm-hmm.
to a famous guy to support him on trial,
Mm-hmm.
who argued that lycanthropy is a real thing
Mm-hmm.
and suffered from it.
Mm-hmm.
And the church supported him. He was a good Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
And the only people who didn't support him were the regular people.
Mm-hmm.
Town. They thought he was a killer.
Mm-hmm.
He ended up in prison and spending his days cross-dressing.
Mm-hmm.
He was killed in his cell. But the thing that fascinated me was that this idea of the church, of course, would, as long as he believes, they're going to support him, because if anybody believes in the supernatural, it's the Catholic Church. They believe the devil, they believe the demons, they believe werewolf, anything. It's just the poor people who have to work every day and give tithe to the church that don't support it. So I like that idea, and I like the idea that of the church having, these. It's sort of like the what's the name of that society in the Catholic Church? I forget, the real extreme right wing
Yes.
society.
Yeah. It doesn't come to mind, but I see what you mean.
It began in Barcelona, and I was living in Barcelona. I went to to some services of that, to a christening of that group. It even went for a talk to make a movie about the founder with them, which would have been interesting. But it's them on steroids, because the Catholic Church there's all the people, but then there's the elites, and they're very extreme, and the supernatural's a real part of it. So I thought it would be fun to have a story where the main character is it's basically a psycho, a Norman Bates type. It's a psycho, a killer, and then it turns into he turns into a superhero.
Yes.
It turns out that all the terrible things he's doing are basically his destiny to a superhero that will then root out the evil within the church. That it's not God's fault. Anyway, I thought it was a fun idea. It kind of got a bit thick and didn't quite hold together, but what are you gonna?
I really had the feeling that it worked very well. It really starts like a slasher and really evolves into something very different. And I really think it's well put together, and that it really caught my attention right from the beginning and held it until the very end. So I really recommend the book to the people.
Well, I really thought I liked the idea of getting into a character who is not skeptical. Because I'm someone that was brought up as a Catholic, and I was brought up in Latin America, Panama, Nicaragua, and there in the 50s, it's heavy. Really, you feel it, and they carry crosses through the street, they chant, everything's full of incense. It's not secular at all.
Yes.
I think it's because it draws from the religions that were there, the indigenous religions. The Catholic Church was brilliant at going in, and they didn't tell them to get rid of their gods and goddesses. They just made them saints and Mary. They just put them in the image of a Catholic deity. But I think it was, the idea of, I, of course, once I hit puberty, one of the worst things, we moved to the United States, and the churches were much less magical. In the US, they don't have that feeling that they do in Latin America, where It's just, greatest show on earth.
mm,
Very horror,
mm,
very horror,
mm.
But then I remember they would have a little pamphlet when you went to church, and at the back they would tell you of all the movies that if you saw them, you had a mortal sin. And they were all the movies I wanted to see. So you see, the movies made me skeptical of the church. I said, "Well, screw this. I know they're wrong. I know they're wrong about that, But I like the idea of someone who didn't go through that,
Mm.
who didn't become skeptical, of
Mm,
religion, who's a believer and who's torn
mm,
by by belief and
mm,
by you
mm,
know and so that for me that was a great deal of fun, that part of it,
mm,
so someone and have kind of a love story between two people who truly believe,
mm, mm,
who are not skeptical, who
mm,
struggle with themselves.
mm.
Mm. Mm.
Were you guys brought up Catholic or?
I'm
No.
French, religion in France is not very present, so
The
I have.
last 200 years it's sort of been,
I was raised by hippies, so no, but uh,
you believe in dream catchers
right. But I know the churches of Latin America, so I know exactly what you're talking about and that real kind of essence of ritual and the power behind it and the almost sort of hysteria that it can inspire in people. We are really, really looking forward to reading the novel of Society. That's a film that we really
it's Zeph Daniel is the name of Woody Keith now.
Uh-huh.
uh-huh.
So Woody Keith was he and Rick Fry wrote the script for
Mm,
Society, but it was actually kind of a weird biography of Woody himself,
mm, mm,
and he would write it secretly because he's from Beverly Hills.
mm,
The characters were kind of people he knew,
Mm.
and very wealthy person. There's schools at USC named after his grandfather, but he felt like the family was very, um, very bad.
mm,
And I think he says, and I believe him, that he was the victim of sexual abuse,
mm.
which is one of the themes of The Shining we didn't mention.
Yes, yes,
The
yeah.
idea that Danny was being
Mm,
sexually abused by
mm,
Jack. But so the script, I had been working with Dan O'Bannon for almost a year before that on this paranoid story called The Men, and
mm,
then Dan kind of backed out, and I was looking for something to do because I had been doing these movies with Stewart and that were being financed by Empire Pictures,
mm,
and then I had to sue them for they were not paying me. I gave them Reanimator to distribute, and then they weren't giving me the money, so I had to sue them. And so then I separated, and I was looking for a project to do,
mm,
and I made a deal with a friend of mine who had a small company to do a couple of movies,
mm,
and that I would direct now.
Mhm.
And I was just handed the script when I was coming out of my office one day, and when I read it, it just had the paranoia
mm.
of what I was working with Dan O'Bannon, and
Uh-huh.
I had been in that paranoid world.
Mm, mm.
And believe me, Dan O'Bannon's a weird guy to work with. Anyway, he lives up to everything you would want from someone who wrote Alien, who wrote Return of the Living Dead.
Mm,
He, but I loved it, but it didn't have anything fantastical.
mm, mm,
And I thought if I'm gonna direct a movie, it's gonna have to have the stuff I like.
mm,
So, and then at the same time, the Japanese companies that were financing it asked me to try to work with Screaming Mad George, who's Japanese. We connected through our interest in surrealism. He's an artist. And so we started, to do the fantastical, I just thought, what would I like to see in a special effect I'd like to see that I had never seen in the movies now today. And it was, I thought, well, I'd like to see flesh melding together. And I think it goes back to when I saw Dr. X, a movie from the 30s, in which there was stuff called synthetic flesh.
Yes.
A few scenes that were colored, I think they were colored, and there was this synthetic flesh and things melding together. And we took that and developed the shunting from it at the same time, working with Woody Keith and Rick Fry to make to incorporate that shunting ritual into the movie instead of, at the time it was just a blood sacrifice. And actually Bill Whitney ends up at home the next day, and things sort of haven't changed. And so, and at the end, so as you can tell from talking about the Pope and stuff, I'm very interested in the mythology. So I tried to create this whole mythology, and because Woody, intrinsic to it was that these are wealthy people. I went to college during the late 60s when there was all that anti-Vietnam march. And it was kind of fun. Politics was everywhere, but it was fun, And I always thought of it that way. And I thought, well, this would be fun to take to kind of caricature, because I knew, back then the left were the crazy one, not the right. Today it's the right. I knew people. I mean, I was a hippie, and I knew people who were crazy revolutionary types. And you become aware of the arguments. And I thought, well, this would be a great way to create a new monster, and have it be based on, class struggle and Marxism. I mean, it's a joke, of course. It's really ridiculous, but it's about rich people, and it's also about madness. It's the same thing we've almost all the movies we've discussed have to do with different types of reality and how they intersect, what's real, what's not real. And so I thought, so we developed the idea of the shunting and created a whole mythology for why they do it and what, the whole reason for it and everything. But I've never been a fan of movies that have the professor get up on the board and tell you the answer to the monster. I feel like you should just kind of not, there shouldn't be a key, you shouldn't put a key to it right there. But I do think it's more, I think the society shunting, the basis of society, there is it's not supernatural. There's a real life type of kind of a scientific basis to it that isn't explained in the movie, but is certainly reflected. Whereas in The Shining, I don't think there is that. I think the haunted house movie is more about not explaining clearly, because if you do, it just isn't supernatural anymore.
Yes.
But anyway, it was then years later, I worked with Woody on a few more movies, him and George. And then, but he's very, he's had a lot of psychological issues. a bit sometimes would go off a little bit. And at one point he moved away to New Mexico, and I lost track of him for many years. And then I heard back from him because he started making his own movies, basically. And he directed them and financed them. And so we quit working together because I was doing my movies. He decided to well, at one point he became this sort of religious guy and changed his name to Zeph Daniel and had this big podcast and was real QAnon type of crazy, there's some Christian extremists just, it's pretty far out. And he was like that. He kind of became part of that community. Conspiracies and, real far right Christian stuff, QAnon type stuff. And then I had tried to make some of his other scripts, tried to make sense out of them. But then at one point he made a documentary called The Dark Side of Society. And he asked me if he contacted me and said, look, we're going to be in LA. Would you do an interview? I said, sure, come to my house and we'll do it. Well, first we went to this bookstore to record Julian Sands, who's the narrator of it. And I worked with Julian Sands in Ramasanta, the werewolf movie. He played Ramasanta. And then after we came to my house and we did a whole thing, because that's where we developed Society, was in my living room downstairs. And so we went to the same place and we had an interview for the documentary. And the documentary was really about his experience writing it. How crazy it is, and so then we had reconnected, and so I was telling him that I have a friend who has a publishing company called Encyclopediocalypse, and he kind of began making. For a while, he ran Clive Barker's businesses, and then he made some publishing to do novelizations of horror movies. And it's, and then also novelizations of things that, writers, you can't get your script sold. Well, write a book about it. And at least it exists then.
Yes.
Yeah. And you get a little bit of money. And so then I talked to Zeph now, said, hey, let's do the novelization. We started working on it. And now I'm holding it up because every time I go through it, every time I read it again, I start rewriting it. And he's kind of like out of his mind because he's kind of, because that's not how he works, right? I'm like really trying to, whenever I read, I go, no, it should be worded this way. But I'm looking forward to it, And then I have a sequel to Society that I wrote with a couple of other people that I really like. I really like the concept of it. I don't think it'll ever get made, but it's fun to do that. And then I was thinking, well, I'll just write the book about the sequel because at least then it's out there.
Yes.
Spend all your time dealing with stuff, and then if it isn't made into a movie, it doesn't exist. You go, well, then just put it somewhere else.
Yes.
I think the book's pretty good. I think it's fun.
We're really looking forward to reading the book and the books, I hope, with Society II, or however you're going to name it, because I mean the Pope was a brilliant book, and I really hope that you continue producing such writing in the same vein in the coming years. We usually like to close the podcast with the question: is there a question that we haven't asked that you think we should have asked?
About The Shining?
Yes, or
anything
any
else.
other subject.
Well, I'm thinking of The Shining here. No, well, we didn't. I don't know if you should have asked it. We didn't mention the topiaries in the maze.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
The maze can also. The hotel was a maze.
Yes.
you
Yes.
know, and the psychology is a maze.
Yes. The
I think
brain.
there's a lot there.
Mhm.
About that. I mean, I think there's so much. There's so many aspects to The Shining that it's hard to say should have, could have, would have.
Mm.
I just think I think it was a good discussion, and I think that there's certainly much more that you can say about it, and I think that's the strength of the movie.
Yes.
For all any criticism there might be, I mean, it's a movie that just seems like it's going to last for a long time.
Yes.
I mean, I think thinking that with Kubrick, probably 2001 and The Shining are probably going to last the most because there's so much more like what they call pure cinema.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. That's really the feeling that I have. I remember as a teenager when I was getting into cult cinema, I was watching films like A Clockwork Orange. And I feel like these days we don't really talk much about A Clockwork Orange or some of the earlier Kubricks, but the ones that really seem to have a lasting power for every generation do seem to be this pairing of 2001 and The Shining. It just, they both continue to kind of flourish in every era.
It just goes to show you Méliès wins.
Yes.
Against the Lumières, he wins.
Yes, totally.
Genre somehow has staying power, I guess.
We so appreciate you. And I just want to thank you before we conclude because in case our listeners are unaware, you co-wrote Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, which was a gateway film to sci-fi for me, especially an homage to all of the wonderful mid-20th century, early 20th century sci-fi. And I just absolutely loved that as a child of the 80s. I was a little bit young at the time. I wouldn't have been allowed to watch The Dentist or something like that. So I had to wait a few more years to catch up with the other films. But that was very...
People always ask about that. How could you and Stuart have done that? Well, we just basically, of course, just wanted to do something for our kids. But I say, you know what? That movie with a little darker lighting and a bad ending is a horror movie.
Yes.
It's not, I mean, fantasy is just a brighter side of the same continuum. I think that if you like horror, you like fantasy. Kubrick grew up reading tons of fairy tales and folk tales. That's used to be the genre, So I do think fantasy is part of the continuum.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for this.
Nice to meet you.
It's so great to meet you.
And I look forward to hearing from you.
And have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to After Images. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and follow After Images podcast on social media.